history of the United States, countless individuals and groups of individuals have taken a stand for their beliefs and their principles. Many of these stands have resulted in enormous change, while others have gone relatively unnoticed. In 1899, a group of boys joined forces to take a stand for themselves and their livelihood. In their youth-led campaign, known as the Newsboy Strike of 1899, the Newsboys of New York City took a stand against the publishers of two of New York City's largest newspapers. This stand captured the attention of New York City, and the newspaper publishers inspired small labor groups across the country to stand up for their rights and draw attention to the harsh practice of child labor in America.
In the late 1800s, newspapers were the primary form of news communications in the United States. In 1898, tension between the United States and Cuba began to increase. The Spanish-American War has been referred to as the first press-driven war because the press fueled the American public's hostility against Cuba through the use of exaggerated and sensational story writing, or yellow journalism. In an effort to keep up with news of the war, the demand for newspapers grew. Many papers added evening editions and circulation increased to unprecedented levels.
The American Industrial Revolution, the dramatic growth in urban cities, and an increase in immigration resulted in a sizable increase in the population and labor demands in New York in the late 1800s. In many households, children were required to get jobs to help pay for food and household needs. Young children, most commonly boys, were hired in place of adults because they could be hired for less. Why hire an adult for $1 when you could hire a kid for a dime? Children took jobs as errand runners and shoeshine boys. Some worked in factories and others began working as newsboys. In the late 1800s, New York City newspapers were distributed primarily by newsboys or newsies. Newsboys would buy papers in bulk and sell them on street corners throughout the city.
Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst owned competing newspapers, the New York World and the New York Journal. In an effort to increase circulation of their papers, Pulitzer and Hearst simplified the language used in their papers and added more pictures to make them easier to read for foreigners and the uneducated. As the public demanded updates on the war, newspaper publishers increased the price of their newspapers. As the Spanish-American War came to an end in August of 1899, the demand for newspapers began to decrease. With decreasing newspaper sales, the publishers refused to decrease their prices to pre-war levels. Since the newsboys were making meager wages, this significantly impacted the amount of money the newsboys made. The result was another war, this one closer to home.
On July 19, 1899, the New York World and the New York Journal announced an increase to the wholesale price of their newspapers from 5 cents to 6 cents for 10 papers, while the customer's cost of the paper remained the same. Newsboys not only had to pay more for the newspapers they bought, but were also no longer refunded for unsold papers. The newsboys protested this change. When the World and Journal refused to change the policy, the New York City newsboys decided to take a stand.
The downtown New York City newsboys gathered in City Hall Park to discuss the details of their strike against the New York World and the New York Journal. They elected officers and communicated their plans with other newsboy groups in the city. The following afternoon, hundreds of newsboys gathered in front of the offices of the World and Journal to physically prevent delivery trucks from leaving with newspapers. Other newsboys gathered and shredded newspapers available for sale. After an unsuccessful attempt to negotiate with Hearst, 5,000 newsboys met at New Irving Hall on July 24th and agreed not to sell the New York World or the New York Journal. At this meeting, a newsboy union was formed. The Newsboy Strike was led by an eye-patch sporting kid in his early teens named Kid Blink. He was quoted as saying, "I'm trying to figure out how 10 cents on 100 papers can mean more to a millionaire than it does to newsboys, and I can't see it. If they can't spare it, how can we?"
The newsboys understood the support of the public and other newspapers was important. They printed flyers to include in rival papers and talked to reporters from these competing papers. The 1899 Newsboy Strike against the New York Journal and the New York World was covered by rival papers in far greater detail than similar strikes by child telegram messengers and bootblacks that were going on at the same time. The publishers began to realize the strike was a real threat when the advertisers began asking for credits on their bills. The New York Journal and the New York World did not take the strike seriously at first. After all, the newsboys were children. In the Wall Street district, the strike was called a nuisance by many citizens of New York. There were reports of bribes and threats of violence against strikers as the newspapers allegedly hired thugs to discourage the newsboys from taking their stand. The newsboy strike continued for 2 weeks. Newsboys were in constant communication, sending representatives to outlying areas to keep them updated on the strike. Within a week, the Newsboy Strike had decreased the circulation of New York World by almost 2/3, from 360,000 papers a day to 125,000 papers a day. On August 2, 1899, Hertz and Pulitzer offered the newsboys a compromise. While they did not agree to lower the price of the newspapers, they did agree to buy back unsold papers. The newsboys accepted the offer and the strike officially ended. Long before the strike of 1899, the newsboys' way of life had been the subject of many articles. In 1853, a reporter described children as a distinct class among themselves. They eat and sleep and make their living and amuse themselves in their own way, perfectly independent of the world so long as their world would buy their papers. Observers described the newsboys' life as a round of irregular work, irregular sleep, and irregular meals, often in close contact with the criminal class.
The New York City Newsboys Strike drew attention to the poor living conditions and lifestyles of young children in the urban cities in the United States. By the 1900s, at least 18% of children were employed. 25% of the children working in the southern cotton mills were below the age of 15, and half of these children were below the age of 12. Up until the 20th century, child labor was an essential factor of the American economy and social life. While child labor and compulsory school laws existed in most states, they are relatively unenforced. In 1902, the New York Child Labor Committee was created with the help of social workers Florence Kelley and Lillian Wald. In 1903, this committee successfully campaigned for a newsboys licensing law, which restricted those who were too young, behind in school, or with health problems from selling papers. This law was ineffective, however, since it lacked police enforcement. The New York Child Labor Committee also succeeded in the passage of several significant measures sponsored by Representatives Edward Finch and Henry Hill. The Finch-Hill Acts instituted the first child labor measure to reach beyond factories and other manufacturing enterprises. This act stated no child under the age of 14 could be employed, permitted, or suffered to work in a factory or in connection to a factory. It also established a maximum 9-hour day for children under 16.
An amendment to the New York State compulsory education law, the Lewis Amendment, was also passed. This law required children to stay in school until the age of 14. It also required working children in the state's larger cities to attend night school to make certain that they received at least an 8th grade education. As a result of the success of the New York Child Labor Committee, the National Child Labor Committee was established in 1904. The issue of child labor was fueled by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. 146 women and girls, some as young as 14, died as a result of poor working conditions that prevented them from escaping the burning factory. The demand for child labor decreased when improvements in machinery reduced the need for unskilled labor, and again when the number of jobs that required higher educational levels increased. The Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. For the first time, a national minimum wage and maximum hour standards was set for miners. This act prohibited miners from working in environments considered hazardous by the Department of Labor.
While the Newsboys Strike of 1899 was not the first or last stand taken by newsboys in the United States, it has become the most well-known. This may be because the young street boys were successful in their efforts to organize themselves, garner support from the public, and significantly impact the profitability of 2 New York City newspapers. It may be because the strike was covered by competing newspapers in an effort to increase their own circulation. For whatever reason, the New York Newsboys Strike provided an example to other labor groups of how to take a stand for their lives and livelihoods. Newsboys strikes have been documented in Chicago, Illinois, Butte, Montana, Portland, Oregon, Louisville, Kentucky, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. While none of these strikes became as well known as a New York City Newsboys strike, in each case of these situations, the newsboys took a stand against the power of the newspaper publisher to protect themselves from decreased wages and unacceptable working conditions.
The stand taken by the New York City newsboys drew attention to unfavorable working conditions and child labor issues and concerns throughout the country. National Labor Committee investigative photographer Lewis Hines traveled the United States taking photographs of the dangerous conditions in which children were working in an effort to convince people that laws regarding child labor were needed. While young workers had also protested their unacceptable working conditions during the late 1800s, the New York City newsboys strike stood out. The New York City newsboys stand in history prove that individuals, small or large, young or old, regardless of wealth or education, can make a difference.
A difference the world will know.
Pulitzer and Hearst, they think we're nothing. Are we nothing? No! Pulitzer and Hearst, they think they got us. Do they got us? No! Even though we ain't got hats or badges, we're a union just by saying so.